The gunshot echoed across the red desert canyon just seconds before the stagecoach lurched forward, leaving Victoria Adams standing alone in a cloud of dust with nothing but a carpet bag and the clothes on her back. She watched in frozen disbelief as the driver whipped the horses into a frenzied gallop, the other passengers inside too terrified to even look back at her through the windows. The reason for their panic became clear when she heard the war cries rising from the rocks above, and her blood turned to ice as she realized she was standing in the middle of Apache territory, with the afternoon sun blazing down and nowhere to run. Victoria was 22 years old, and until 3 minutes ago, she had been traveling from Santa Fe to meet her aunt in Enid, Oklahoma. The stagecoach driver had demanded she get out when one of the wheels needed inspection, but the moment her feet touched the ground, Apache scouts had appeared on the ridge. The coward had abandoned her without a second thought, valuing his own skin and that of the paying passengers over a woman traveling alone. Now she stood in the New Mexico desert in 1878, wearing a dusty blue traveling dress, her dark blonde hair coming loose from its pins, and her green eyes scanning the hostile landscape for any hope of survival. The war cries faded as quickly as they had come. Either the Apache had not been interested in attacking after all, or they had decided to wait and watch. Victoria forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her chest. She could see the stagecoach disappearing into the distance, a diminishing black dot against the endless expanse of sand and scrub. Behind her, steep canyon walls rose up in layers of red and orange stone. Ahead, the trail stretched toward a horizon that shimmered with heat. She had maybe 2 hours of good daylight left, a single canteen of water, and no real knowledge of how to survive out here. She started walking in the direction the stagecoach had gone, because staying still felt like waiting to die. Her leather boots kicked up dust with every step, and the sun seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She had been raised in Boston, educated at a proper girls' school, and had only come west after her parents died of influenza last winter. Everything about this land felt alien and hostile. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the whisper of wind through the sage and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. After an hour of walking, her water was half gone, and her throat felt lined with sand. Her feet ached, and she could feel blisters forming inside her boots. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. She had just begun to accept that she might not survive the night when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Victoria spun around, her heart hammering. A single rider was approaching from the north, following a parallel trail that intersected with the stagecoach road. He sat tall in the saddle on a paint horse, and even from a distance, she could see the rifle across his lap and the wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. She stood frozen, uncertain whether this was rescue or a different kind of danger. In her experience, men who rode alone in country like this were either lawmen, outlaws, or cowboys with their own code of honor. She would have to gamble on which one he was. The rider slowed as he approached, and she got her first clear look at him. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of stubble and eyes the color of desert sage. He wore dusty trail clothes, a leather vest over a worn shirt, and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but there was something steady in his gaze that made her relax just slightly. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and carried a Texas drawl. "You look like you are in some trouble." "The stagecoach left me," Victoria said, hating how her voice shook. There were Apache on the ridge and the driver panicked. He just left me here. The cowboy's jaw tightened and something dark flashed through his eyes. That's so. Well, that is about the lowest thing I have heard all month, and I just came from a town with a crooked sheriff. He swung down from his horse with easy grace and stood looking at her, his expression both concerned and angry on her behalf. Name is Dalton Vance. I am headed toward Enid, Oklahoma myself. Reckon I could escort you that way if you do not mind riding double for a spell. Victoria Adams, she said, relief washing through her so strongly that her knees went weak. And I would be grateful beyond words. I thought I was going to die out here. Not on my watch, Dalton said firmly. He pulled his canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. Drink slow. We have got a ways to go before we make camp, and I need you staying hydrated and alert. This country does not forgive mistakes. Victoria drank carefully, the water tasting better than anything she had ever consumed. She watched as Dalton secured her carpet bag behind his saddle, his movements efficient and practiced. Up close, she could see the calluses on his hands, the sun lines at the corners of his eyes, the way he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew this land intimately. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way that was entirely different from the polished gentleman she had known back east. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I have ridden before," she said. "English saddle in riding parks, nothing like this." "It will do." He swung back into the saddle and then reached down to help her up. His hand was strong and warm, and she felt a strange flutter in her stomach as he pulled her up behind him. "Hold on to me. We have maybe 2 hours before full dark, and I want to put some distance between us and this place. Those Apache you saw are probably still watching." Victoria wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid strength of him through his shirt. The horse moved forward at a steady trot, and she held on tight, trying not to think about how close she was pressed against this stranger, or how safe she suddenly felt despite still being in danger. Dalton rode with the ease of someone who had spent his whole life in the saddle, his body moving with the rhythm of the horse, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape around them. "Why were you out here alone?" she asked after a while, needing to break the tense silence. "Working cattle for a ranch about 40 miles back," Dalton said without turning his head, his attention still on their surroundings. "Contract ended yesterday, and I figured I would head north toward Oklahoma. Heard there is work there, maybe land opening up for homesteading. A man can make something of himself if he is willing to work hard and deal with some hardship. You want to be a homesteader. I want to have something that is mine," he said simply. "Been working other people's ranches since I was 15. My pa died when I was young, and my ma followed him a few years later. I have been drifting ever since, working where I can, saving what I can. Figure it is time to put down roots somewhere." There was a loneliness in his words that resonated with Victoria's own situation. "I lost my parents last winter," she said quietly. "That is why I am heading to Enid. My Aunt Martha owns a boarding house there. She wrote and said I could come live with her, maybe help her run the place. I did not have anything keeping me in Boston." "I am sorry about your folks," Dalton said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "It is hard, being alone in the world." "Yes," she agreed softly. "It is." They rode in silence after that, the sun sinking lower until the desert was bathed in gold and shadow. Dalton finally guided the horse off the main trail toward a rocky outcropping that formed a natural shelter. "We will camp here," he said. "There is some cover, and I can build a fire small enough that it will not be seen from a distance. You must be exhausted." Victoria slid down from the horse with his help, her legs trembling from the unfamiliar exercise and the aftermath of fear. Dalton moved around the campsite with practiced efficiency, unsaddling his horse and rubbing the animal down, then gathering dry brush for a fire. Victoria tried to help, but she felt useless and clumsy, her city upbringing leaving her with no practical skills for this environment. "Just sit and rest," Dalton said, but his tone was kind rather than dismissive. "You have had a hell of a day." He built a small fire and produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, along with coffee grounds and a battered pot. The simple meal tasted wonderful, and Victoria ate gratefully, watching him across the firelight. In the flickering shadows, his face looked older, more careworn, but there was a gentleness in the way he moved that put her at ease. "Tell me about Boston," he said after they had eaten, leaning back against his saddle. "I have never been farther east than St. Louis." So Victoria told him about the narrow brick streets, the harbor with its ships from around the world, the libraries and theaters and restaurants. She told him about her childhood, her education, the protected life she had led until influenza had stolen everything familiar. Dalton listened with genuine interest, asking questions, his eyes never leaving her face. She found herself talking more than she had in months, the words spilling out in the safety of the firelight and his steady presence. "Sounds like a different world," he said when she finally fell silent. "I grew up on a hardscrabble ranch in South Texas. Learned to ride before I could barely walk, spent my days chasing cattle and fixing fence. Never had much schooling, but I can read and figure, and I know this land. We are about as different as two people can be, Miss Adams." "Call me Victoria," she said. "After you saved my life, I think we can dispense with formality." "Victoria," he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his drawl. "Well then, you should call me Dalton, and I did not save your life yet. We still have got a few days of hard riding before we reach Enid, and this is dangerous country, but I give you my word I will get you there safe." "I believe you," she said, and realized she meant it. There was something about this man, this stranger, that made her trust him completely. They laid out their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Dalton insisting she take his blanket in addition to her own. The desert night was cold after the blazing heat of the day, and Victoria wrapped herself tightly, staring up at the stars scattered across the black sky. They were brighter here than they had ever been in Boston, millions of them forming a river of light across the heavens. "Dalton," she said softly into the darkness. "Yeah, thank you for stopping, for helping me. Not everyone would have." "I am not everyone," he said quietly. "Try to sleep, Victoria. I will keep watch." She wanted to protest, to tell him he needed rest too, but exhaustion dragged her down into sleep before she could form the words. Her last conscious thought was that she felt safer here, in the middle of hostile territory with a man she had just met, than she had felt in months. Victoria woke to the smell of coffee and the pale gray light of dawn. Dalton was already up, the fire rebuilt, his rifle across his knees as he scanned the desert around them. He looked tired, and she realized he had probably stayed awake all night keeping guard. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in her chest at the thought of him protecting her through the dark hours. "Morning," he said, handing her a tin cup of strong black coffee. "We should get moving soon. I want to cover good ground before the heat sets in." They ate a quick breakfast of more jerky and the last of some cornbread Dalton had in his supplies, then packed up camp. Victoria felt stiff and sore from yesterday's ride, but she climbed up behind Dalton without complaint. His horse, a sturdy paint gelding named Tracker, seemed resigned to carrying double weight. As they set off northward, the sun rose behind them, painting long shadows across the desert floor. The landscape gradually changed as they rode, the harsh red rock giving way to rolling plains dotted with scrub oak and juniper. They stopped at a small creek around midday to water the horse and refill their canteens. Victoria knelt beside the stream, splashing water on her face and neck, feeling the dust and grime of travel washing away at least temporarily. When she looked up, she caught Dalton watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He looked away quickly, but she had seen something in his eyes that made her heart skip. "How much farther to the next town?" she asked, trying to cover her confusion. "There is a settlement called Red Rock about 20 miles northeast," Dalton said, studying the horizon. "It is not much, just a trading post and a few buildings, but we can get proper supplies there. Rest the horse too. We have been pushing hard." They reached Red Rock late that afternoon. It was even smaller than Dalton had suggested. Just a handful of weathered structures clustered around a dusty crossroads. The trading post was run by a grizzled old man who looked at Victoria with obvious curiosity, clearly wondering about her relationship with Dalton. The cowboy paid for beans, bacon, more coffee, and fresh hardtack without comment, then bought grain for Tracker. "There is a woman who runs a sort of boarding house here," the trader said, nodding toward a slightly larger building across the way. "She might let you have a room for the night if you have coin, save you sleeping rough." "That would be appreciated," Victoria said before Dalton could refuse. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the way he was holding himself stiffly. He needed a real night's sleep. The woman, Mrs. Henderson, was a widow in her 50s who asked no questions and offered them 2 rooms at a reasonable price. Victoria almost wept with relief at the sight of an actual bed, even though it was just a thin mattress on a rope frame. There was a basin for washing, and Mrs. Henderson even provided hot water. Victoria cleaned herself as best she could, changed into her one spare dress from the carpet bag, and felt almost human again. Dalton had cleaned up too. She saw when they met for supper in Mrs. Henderson's small dining room. He had shaved and changed into a cleaner shirt, and with the trail dust washed away, he looked younger and even more handsome. His dark hair was still damp and curled slightly at his collar, and his gray-green eyes were startling in his tanned face. Victoria felt that flutter in her stomach again, stronger this time, and recognized it with some alarm as attraction. Mrs. Henderson served them beef stew and fresh bread, luxuries after days of trail food. They ate mostly in silence, both too hungry and tired for conversation, but Victoria was intensely aware of Dalton across the table from her. She watched his hands as he tore the bread, remembered the strength in them when he had pulled her up onto his horse. She found herself noticing the shape of his mouth, the way he smiled slightly when he caught her looking at him. "What is it?" he asked softly. "Nothing," she said quickly, feeling heat rise to her face. "I was just thinking how strange life is. 3 days ago, I was on a stagecoach thinking my biggest worry would be making a good impression on my aunt. Now I am sitting in a frontier trading post with a cowboy I just met, and somehow that feels more real than anything in my old life ever did." Dalton set down his spoon, his expression serious. "Victoria, I need to be straight with you about something. We still have got days of hard travel ahead. The country between here and Enid is not as bad as where I found you, but it is not safe either. There are outlaws, rustlers, sometimes hostile Indians. I am good with a gun and I know the land, but I am just one man. I cannot promise nothing will happen." "I know," she said quietly, "but I would rather take my chances with you than be alone. I trust you, Dalton." Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability that made him look almost boyish despite his weathered face. "You should not," he said roughly. "You do not know me. I have done things in my life I am not proud of. I have been in fights, shot men who needed shooting. I am not a gentleman like you are probably used to. "I do not want a gentleman," Victoria said, surprised by her own certainty. "Gentlemen left me standing in Apache territory to die. You stopped to help a stranger. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." Dalton looked at her for a long moment, something burning in his eyes that made her breath catch. Then he pushed back from the table, the moment breaking. "We should get some sleep. I want to leave at first light." Victoria lay awake in her narrow bed that night, staring at the rough wooden ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to her. She barely knew this man. They came from completely different worlds. But there was a connection between them, something that had sparked to life the moment he had ridden up on that desert trail. She could not stop thinking about him, about the way he had given her his blanket without hesitation, the way he had stayed awake all night to keep her safe, the gentleness in his rough hands. She was falling for him. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She had never felt this way about anyone, not even the suitors her parents had tried to match her with in Boston. Those men had been appropriate, educated, from good families. Dalton was none of those things. He was a drifting cowboy with no real home, heading north to chase a dream of land and independence. There was no logical reason why her heart should race every time he looked at her, but it did. They left Red Rock at dawn, tracker refreshed and their supplies restocked. The land continued to gradually change as they traveled north, becoming less desert and more plains. They saw distant herds of cattle, occasional homesteads scattered across the grassland, and once a small group of buffalo that made Victoria gasp with delight. Dalton told her stories as they rode, about his years working ranches, about cattle drives and dust storms, about the time he had broken his arm when a horse threw him and had to set it himself. His life had been hard in ways she could barely imagine, but there was no self-pity in his telling, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that this was how things were. On the third day out from Red Rock, they ran into trouble. They had just forded a small river and were climbing the bank when 3 riders appeared from behind a stand of cottonwoods. They were rough-looking men on rough-looking horses, and the way they spread out deliberately to block the trail made Dalton tense immediately. "Easy," he muttered to Victoria. "Let me handle this." "Well now," the lead rider said, a big man with a scarred face and a yellow beard. "What do we have here? Cowboy and his lady taking a pleasure ride, just passing through," Dalton said evenly. His right hand had moved casually to rest near his pistol. "We do not want any trouble." "Oh, but maybe we do," another rider said, this one thin and weasel-faced. "That is a nice horse you got there. Nice lady, too. Seems like you got more than your share of good fortune, friend." "I am not your friend," Dalton said, his voice going cold in a way that made Victoria shiver. "And we are riding on. You boys should do the same." The big man laughed. "I do not think so. See, we make a living by redistributing wealth out here. You look like you have got some coin in those saddlebags, and like my friend said, that is a fine horse. The girl can come too if she wants to keep breathing." Everything happened very fast. The third rider, who had been quiet until now, went for his gun. Dalton was faster. His pistol cleared leather and fired in one smooth motion, and the man flew backward off his horse with a cry. The big man cursed and drew his own weapon, but Dalton had already kicked Tracker into motion, sending the horse crashing into the man's mount and spoiling his aim. Victoria clung on desperately, her arms locked around Dalton's waist as he guided the horse with his knees and fired again. The weasel-faced man took a bullet in the shoulder and wheeled his horse away, screaming, "Get out of here!" Dalton roared at him, his gun now trained on the big man, who had dropped his weapon and was holding up his hands. "Both of you ride. If I see you following us, I will finish this." The 2 wounded outlaws did not need to be told twice. They spurred their horses and fled back the way they had come, leaving their dead companion lying in the grass. Dalton holstered his pistol, his hand shaking slightly now that the danger had passed. Victoria realized she was trembling against his back, her breathing fast and shallow. "Are you all right?" Dalton asked urgently, twisting to look at her. "Victoria, are you hit?" "No," she managed. "No, I am fine. I am good." He guided Tracker away from the scene, putting distance between them and the body. Once they were a few hundred yards away, he stopped and helped her down, then dismounted himself. His legs were unsteady, she saw, the aftermath of the fight catching up to him. She threw her arms around him without thinking, needing to feel that he was solid and real and alive. Dalton stiffened for a moment, then his arms came around her, holding her tight. She could feel his heart pounding against her cheek, smell the sweat and gunpowder on his clothes. "I am sorry," he said hoarsely. "I am sorry you had to see that. I did not want to kill him, but he did not leave me a choice." "You saved us," Victoria said, pulling back to look up at him. "They would have robbed us and worse. You did what you had to do." His eyes searched her face as if looking for judgment or condemnation. Whatever he saw there made something in him relax. "You are not like any woman I have ever met," he said softly. "A Boston lady who does not faint at gunfire." "Maybe I am not much of a Boston lady anymore," she said. "Maybe that girl died when the stagecoach left her in the desert, and someone new is being born." Dalton's hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing her skin with surprising gentleness. For a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her, and her lips parted in anticipation. But then he seemed to catch himself and stepped back, his hand falling away. "We should keep moving," he said roughly. "Those men might come back with friends." They rode hard for the rest of the day, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the scene of the gunfight. Dalton was tense and watchful, his hand never far from his pistol, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Victoria held onto him and tried not to think about how much she had wanted him to kiss her, how disappointed she had been when he pulled away. They made camp that night in a small hollow sheltered by a ring of rocks. Dalton built a tiny fire, just enough for coffee, and they ate cold food rather than risk the smoke from cooking. The silence between them felt different now, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Victoria watched him across the fire, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept cleaning and checking his pistol even though she was sure it was already perfect. "Dalton," she said finally, "what you said before, about not being a gentleman, about having shot men, that does not change how I see you." He looked up at her, his eyes shadowed in the firelight. "It should. A woman like you should not be mixed up with a man like me. You should be in a nice house somewhere, married to a banker or a lawyer, raising kids and going to church socials." "Is that what you think I want?" Victoria asked, feeling a spark of anger. "You think I want some boring, respectable life with a man who would leave a woman to die rather than risk his own comfort. I am not that person, Dalton. Maybe I never was, or maybe 3 days in the desert burned it out of me. But I am here, right now, with you, and that is exactly where I want to be. Victoria." Her name was rough on his lips. "You do not know what you are saying. We have been thrown together by circumstances. When you get to your aunt's boarding house and settle in, start a new life, you will forget all about me." "Will I?" she challenged. "Will you forget about me?" He stared at her across the fire, and she saw the war playing out in his expression, honor fighting with desire. "No," he said finally, the word pulled from him like a confession. "God help me, I know I should, but I do not think I could forget you if I tried." Victoria stood up and walked around the fire to him. She knelt beside him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his gray-green eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Then do not try," she whispered. "Do not walk away from this from us because you think I am too good for you. I get to decide what I want, Dalton. And I want you." He made a sound low in his throat, somewhere between a groan and a surrender. Then his hand was in her hair, pulling her forward, and his mouth was on hers. The kiss was everything she had imagined and more, fierce and hungry and desperate. His lips were firm and warm, and he tasted like coffee and the wild open spaces. Victoria kissed him back with all the longing that had been building inside her since the moment he had pulled her onto his horse, her hands gripping the front of his shirt, her whole body leaning into him. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Dalton rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "This is crazy," he whispered. "We have known each other less than a week." "I know," Victoria said, her lips still tingling from the kiss. "I do not care. Your aunt is going to take one look at me and send me packing. Then I will leave with you." He pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. "You would really do that? Give up a safe home and security for a drifting cowboy with nothing but a horse and a dream?" "Yes," Victoria said simply. "I would. Because in the past few days I have felt more alive, more myself than I ever did in Boston. Because you make me feel safe and challenged and excited all at once. Because when I think about the future, I cannot imagine you not being in it." Dalton kissed her again, softer this time, with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. "I have been alone for so long," he said against her lips. "I did not think I would ever find someone who could understand this life, who could be happy with what little I have to offer. But you, Victoria Adams, you are something I never expected." They held each other for a long time, the fire burning low beside them. Victoria felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world, as though everything she had been before this moment had just been preparation for meeting this man. When they finally separated to their bedrolls, it was with reluctance, with frequent glances across the dying embers, with the unspoken understanding that everything had changed. The next 4 days of travel passed in a haze of growing intimacy. They talked constantly, learning each other's stories, sharing dreams and fears and the small details that make up a life. Dalton told her about the land he hoped to claim in Oklahoma, near Enid, where the soil was supposed to be rich and water plentiful. He painted pictures with his words of the house he would build, the cattle he would raise, the life he wanted to create. Victoria found herself fitting into that picture as naturally as breathing, imagining herself beside him building something real and lasting. They kissed whenever they stopped to rest, hungry stolen moments that left them both aching for more. But Dalton was careful to maintain propriety, to treat her with respect, despite the passion that burned between them. Victoria loved him for it, even as she wanted to throw propriety to the wind and demand more than kisses. On the 8th day after he had found her in the desert, they rode into Enid, Oklahoma. The town was larger than Red Rock but still small by Boston standards, a collection of wooden buildings lining a wide main street. There was a general store, a saloon, a church, a schoolhouse, and scattered among them, the businesses that kept a frontier town alive. Dalton asked directions to Martha Adams's boarding house and received curious looks from several townsfolk who clearly wondered about the dusty cowboy and the travel-worn woman riding double. The boarding house was a 2-story structure at the edge of town, painted white with green shutters and a wide front porch. A plump woman in her 50s was sweeping the porch steps when they arrived. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, and her face broke into a smile of recognition. "Victoria," she cried, dropping the broom and rushing down the steps. "Oh, my dear girl, you are finally here. I got your telegram from Santa Fe, but when the stage came through yesterday without you, I was so worried." Victoria slid down from Tracker with Dalton's help, and immediately found herself enveloped in her aunt's embrace. Martha smelled like bread and lavender, and Victoria felt tears prick her eyes at the warmth of the greeting. "There was trouble," she said, pulling back. "The stagecoach driver abandoned me when Apache scouts appeared. If not for Dalton, I do not know what would have happened to me." Martha turned to look at Dalton, who had removed his hat and was standing awkwardly beside his horse. "You saved my niece?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I just helped her along the way, madam," Dalton said, clearly uncomfortable with the gratitude in Martha's eyes. "Any decent person would have done the same." "But they did not," Martha said firmly. "That cowardly driver did not. You did. Please come inside, both of you. You must be exhausted. I will make food, draw baths, get you settled." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Martha insisted Dalton stay for supper at the very least, and would not hear his protests. Victoria was shown to a lovely room on the second floor with lace curtains and a real brass bed. There was hot water for washing, and clean clothes that Martha had set aside for her. Victoria scrubbed away the dust of the trail and changed into a proper dress, doing her hair up in a style she had not worn since leaving Boston. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The girl looking back was tanned and leaner, with a new hardness around the eyes but also a new light, a vitality that had not been there before. When she came downstairs, she found Dalton in the parlor, also cleaned up and looking uncomfortable in the refined surroundings. He stood when she entered, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "You are beautiful," he said simply. "So are you," she said, then laughed at the surprise on his face. "What, men cannot be beautiful? Handsome, maybe," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Rugged. But beautiful is for ladies like you." "You are beautiful to me," Victoria said softly, moving closer. She wanted to touch him, to kiss him, but was acutely aware that they were in her aunt's house, that there were proprieties to observe. Martha called them to dinner, a feast by trail standards, fried chicken and mashed potatoes and greens from the garden and fresh bread still warm from the oven. She asked Dalton about the journey, and he gave her a carefully edited version that downplayed the danger and his own heroism. But Martha was no fool. She looked between the two of them with shrewd eyes, clearly seeing the way they watched each other, the way their hands almost touched across the table. After dinner, Martha excused herself to check on her other boarders, giving them a few moments alone. Dalton stood awkwardly in the parlor, turning his hat in his hands. "I should go," he said. "Find a place to stable Tracker, maybe get a room at the saloon for the night." "And then what?" Victoria asked, her heart sinking. "You ride off tomorrow to look for land, and I never see you again." "Victoria!" He set down his hat and came to her, taking her hands in his. "I do not have anything to offer you yet. No land, no house, barely enough money to file a homestead claim. It would not be right to ask you to wait for me while I try to build something. What if I do not want to wait?" Victoria said fiercely. "What if I want to help you build it? Dalton, I have fallen in love with you. I know it is fast and crazy and makes no sense, but it is true. And I hope you feel the same way." "I do," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God help me, Victoria. I have been in love with you since about the second day on the trail. But I am trying to do the honorable thing here. You deserve better than a dirt poor cowboy with nothing but dreams." "You are everything I want," she said, stepping closer until they were almost touching. "Let me come with you. Let me be part of those dreams. We can homestead together, build a life together. Please, Dalton, do not walk away from this because of some misguided idea about what I deserve." He looked down at her, and she saw the moment he stopped fighting, the moment his resolve crumbled. "You are sure?" he asked. "It will be hard, Victoria, harder than anything you have ever done. Living in a dugout or a tent while we build a proper house, working sun up to sun down, dealing with drought and storms and all the thousand things that can go wrong." "I am sure," she said, "as long as I am with you." Dalton pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made her dizzy. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright. "Then marry me," he said. "Right now, tomorrow, as soon as we can find a preacher. I want to do this proper. I want you to be my wife before we start our life together." "Yes," Victoria breathed. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married 2 days later in the small church on Main Street. Martha had been surprised but supportive, recognizing real love when she saw it. She had helped Victoria into a simple white dress borrowed from one of the other boarders, had fussed over her hair and offered her own grandmother's ring as something borrowed. The ceremony was brief and simple, attended only by Martha and a few curious townspeople. But when Dalton slid a plain gold band onto Victoria's finger and promised to love and cherish her for all his days, it felt more sacred and real than any elaborate Boston wedding could have been. Their wedding night was spent in the little room at the boarding house, with Martha discreetly staying downstairs and giving them privacy. Victoria was nervous, her education on marital matters being limited to vague hints and whispers. But Dalton was gentle and patient, taking time to ease her fears, making their joining something beautiful rather than frightening. Afterwards, lying in his arms with the moonlight streaming through the lace curtains, Victoria felt complete in a way she never had before. No regrets. Dalton murmured against her hair. "Not a single one," she said, pressing a kiss to his chest. "You are stuck with me now, Cowboy." "Best thing that ever happened to me," he said, tightening his arms around her. "Getting stuck with you." They left Enid a week later, after Dalton had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres about 10 miles north of town. The land was raw prairie, with a small creek running through one corner and a stand of cottonwood trees near what would become their home site. They traveled there with Tracker, now pulling a small wagon loaded with supplies Martha had helped them purchase on credit, to be paid back as they could. Dalton had also bought 2 milk cows and some chickens, the beginnings of their farm. The first months were brutally hard. They lived in a dugout carved into a hillside, a single room half underground with a canvas roof. It was dark and cramped and smelled of earth, but it was shelter. They worked from dawn until dark, Dalton breaking sod for planting while Victoria learned to cook over an open fire, to milk cows, to do 100 tasks that would have seemed impossible back in Boston. Her hands became calloused, her skin burned dark by the sun, her muscles strong from hard labor. And through it all, she was happier than she had ever been. Dalton was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish for not knowing how to do things. He taught her to ride properly, to handle a gun in case she needed to protect herself when he was away. He was affectionate and considerate, always making sure she had enough to eat even if it meant he went without, building her small luxuries like a proper door for the dugout and a shelf for her few treasured belongings. At night, in their narrow bed made of rope and straw, he held her close and they talked about the future, about the house they would build, the children they would have. By fall, they had a small vegetable garden producing squash and beans. The cows were giving good milk, and the chickens were laying. Dalton had built a small barn for the animals and had started cutting and hauling stones for the foundation of their house. Victoria had learned to make butter and cheese, to preserve vegetables for winter to sow and mend. Neighbors started appearing, other homesteaders drawn to the area, and a sense of community began to form. There were barn raisings and church socials, quilting bees and harvest celebrations. Victoria found herself part of a network of frontier women, all of them working to build lives in this hard land, all of them supporting each other through the difficulties. One cold November evening, as they sat by the fire in their dugout, Victoria placed Dalton's hand on her belly and told him she was pregnant. The joy on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He picked her up and spun her around despite the low ceiling, then spent the rest of the evening making plans and worrying about her health and talking about whether it would be a boy or a girl. Their son was born the following June, delivered by a neighbor woman experienced in midwifery while Dalton paced outside, alternately praying and panicking. Victoria named him James, after her father, and Dalton cried when she handed the baby to him for the first time. Watching her strong cowboy husband cradle their tiny son with such gentleness and wonder, Victoria felt her heart overflow with love. The house was finished that fall, a solid two-room structure made of stone and wood with real glass windows and a shingle roof. It was not fancy, but it was sturdy and warm, and it was theirs. They moved out of the dugout with great ceremony, carrying baby James and their few possessions into their new home. That night, lying in their new bed in their new house, Victoria thought about the girl who had been abandoned in Apache territory just over 2 years ago. She felt like a different person now, and in many ways she was. That girl had been lost and frightened, unsure of who she was or what she wanted. This woman knew exactly who she was, a homesteader's wife, a mother, a partner in building something lasting. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, pulling her close. "How lucky I am," Victoria said. "How strange it is that the worst moment of my life led to the best things in it. If that stagecoach driver had not abandoned me, we never would have met." "I would like to think we would have found each other somehow," Dalton said. "We were meant to be together, Victoria, I am sure of it." "So am I," she said, kissing him softly. "So am I." The years that followed brought their share of hardships, drought years and blizzards, times when money was so tight they wondered if they would lose the land. But they also brought 3 more children, 2 daughters named Sarah and Elizabeth, and another son they called Daniel. The farm prospered slowly but steadily, growing from their original homestead claim to include adjoining land. Dalton proved to have a gift for working with horses, and began breeding and training them to supplement their farming income. Victoria kept her chickens and cows, sold eggs and butter in town, and developed a reputation for the quilts she sewed during the long winter months. They aged together, their faces weathering under the Oklahoma sun, their hands growing more calloused, their bodies marked by the hard work of frontier life. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew deeper and richer with the passing years, tempered by shared trials and joys, by the life they had built together from nothing. Victoria never regretted her decision to marry Dalton, instead of staying in her aunt's boarding house and waiting for some more suitable man to court her. She knew her life was harder than it would have been, but it was also infinitely more rewarding. She had a partner who treated her as an equal, who valued her opinions and her work, who loved her completely. She had children who were strong and capable and kind, raised to respect the land and each other. She had a place that was truly hers, land that bore the mark of her labor and love. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised her by taking her back to the spot where he had found her all those years ago. They made the journey on horseback, just the 2 of them, leaving the children with neighbors. It took 3 days to reach the Red Desert Canyon where the stagecoach had abandoned her, and when Victoria stood again in that place, she could barely recognize the frightened girl she had been. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, looking around at the familiar landscape that now seemed so much less threatening. "Because I wanted to remember," Dalton said, dismounting and coming to help her down. "I wanted us both to remember where we started, how far we have come. Victoria, every single day for the past 20 years, I have thanked God for putting me on that trail the day you needed me. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Victoria looked at her husband, at the silver threading his dark hair, at the deep lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, at the hands that were scarred from 1,000 tasks. She saw the boy he had been, the drifting cowboy with nothing but a dream, and the man he had become, a successful rancher and respected member of the community. Most of all, she saw the love in his eyes, as strong now as it had been that first night when he had kissed her by the campfire. "You saved me that day," she said, "but you have saved me every day since. You gave me a life I could never have imagined, a love I did not know existed. I would do it all again, Dalton, every hard moment, every struggle, just to end up here with you." He kissed her then, deep and long, and Victoria felt like that young woman again, filled with hope and love and the absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. They made camp there that night, under the same stars that had watched over their first nights together, and made love with the passion and tenderness of people who knew each other completely and loved what they knew. When they returned home, it was to find their eldest son James, now 19, had asked permission to file his own homestead claim on adjoining land. He had been courting a neighbor girl and wanted to start building a life of his own. Watching her son prepare to embark on the same journey she and Dalton had taken, Victoria felt the circle completing. The land they had claimed from raw prairie was becoming a legacy for their children. More years passed, bringing grandchildren and gray hair, successes and losses. Martha passed away when Victoria was 45, leaving her the boarding house in Enid. Victoria and Dalton discussed selling it, but in the end decided to keep it, hiring someone to manage it while using the income to improve their ranch. It felt right, keeping that connection to the place where their married life had begun. When Dalton was 60, he had a serious fall from a horse that left him laid up for weeks with broken ribs. Lying in their bed while Victoria nursed him, he confessed his fear that he was getting too old for the hard physical labor of ranching. But their sons and sons-in-law had stepped in without being asked, managing the ranch and the horses, proving that what they had built would continue after they were gone. "We did it," Dalton said one evening as they sat on the porch of their house, now expanded and refined over the years. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter floating up to them on the warm summer air. "We actually did it, Victoria. We took nothing and made it into all of this." "We did," Victoria agreed, reaching over to take his hand. His fingers laced with hers automatically, the gesture as natural after 40 years as breathing. And it was worth every moment. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole community turned out for a celebration at the ranch. There were 3 generations of Vances present, along with friends and neighbors who had shared the journey of settling this land. Someone had made a banner that read, "50 years of love," and it hung across the front of the barn. There was music and dancing, enough food to feed an army, and speech after speech about what Dalton and Victoria meant to the community. But the moment Victoria treasured most came late in the evening, when the party was winding down, and she and Dalton stood together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Dalton pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head, and said simply, "I love you, Victoria Vance. I loved you the moment I saw you standing alone in that desert, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Victoria said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. My cowboy, my partner, my everything. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for this life." They lived 15 more years, growing old together with grace and humor. Dalton passed first, quietly in his sleep at the age of 90, and Victoria followed him within the year. The doctors said it was her heart, but their children knew better. She had simply decided she had lived long enough without her partner and had chosen to follow him into whatever came next. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch. Under a large cottonwood tree, Dalton had planted their first year on the land. The headstone was simple, marked with their names, their dates, and a single line that Victoria had requested years before. He found her in the desert, and they built paradise together. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own mark but never forgetting the foundation laid by Dalton and Victoria. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. How a frightened city girl had been abandoned in Apache territory. How a drifting cowboy had stopped to help. How what should have been a simple escort had turned into a love story for the ages. In the end, that was their legacy. Not just the land or the house or the successful ranch, but the proof that love could grow in the hardest of circumstances. That two people from completely different worlds could find common ground and build something beautiful together. They had taken nothing, the abandoned and the drifter, and created everything, a dynasty of love and hard work that would continue for generations to come. And somewhere in the red desert where it all began, if you listen carefully on quiet evenings when the sun is setting, you can almost hear the echo of hoofbeats, of a cowboy riding to a rescue that would change two lives forever, of a love story that turned abandonment into destiny.